definitely hearing about your transition from Cornell to Copenhagen. The floor is yours, Serge.
Great. How's the audio? Good. So thanks so much for the invitation and the very kind introduction, Christian. So I'll be talking about some representations and taxonomies and ontologies and so on that could be useful for analyzing the spread of information in social media. As Christian mentioned, I'm moving to the University of Copenhagen, so that position starts next month. And I certainly would be happy to take questions about that at the end or offline. But for our current purposes, what I would like to do is showcase some of the work from my group at Cornell that was done with the support of Facebook. So Facebook Research provided a grant to Cornell a few years ago and started a close collaboration with Sernam Lim's team. So we wanted to attack this problem starting from studying intent behind Facebook posts, or more generally posts on social media. So this talk is really just a collection of, or a set of showcases for what different students did as part of that collaboration with Facebook. So I'll start with the work of Manglin Jha, one of our PhD students, and focus on her work on intentonomy and a little glimpse at more recent work on something called VISE, visual engagement. Intentonomy connects with the world of fine-grained categorization. Now we're more, probably most of us are familiar with fine-grained categorization for things like species recognition or breeds of dogs and cats, or analysis of fashion or apparel. In the context of intentonomy, we're interested in bringing that sensibility to intent. And in other words, why is it that someone is posting something to social media? So from the factual perspective, we're familiar with plenty of approaches, most recently contrastive learning or deep metric learning approaches, where we want to study what is present inside an image. So that would be the content part. And so for purposes of training, we could look at triplet data that tells us these two images of birds represent the same species, and these two images represent different species, and so forth. We're more interested in intentonomy in the why. So when you're scrolling through your social feed and you see that somebody posted something, some paragraph, an image, a meme, why did they post it? What was the intent behind it? Was it to convey a sense of harmony or irritation, or that they're in love with a partner? And in this case, there is often a conflict between content and intent. So if you look from a pixel perspective at some images that you might see on Instagram, the image showing harmony and the image showing annoying are kind of similar from a pixel or feature perspective. But they actually represent different intents. Whereas this other picture of harmony is rather different. And we would say that those actually represent two things that are capturing the same kind of motive or intent. And similarly, these things representing in love, these are cases that are a little bit more similar from a pixel perspective. Enjoying nature would be something we'd consider a negative. So this brought us to develop what we call intentonomy. So this is a hierarchical characterization of different intents. This was developed together, this was developed based on research from social psychology. So this is capturing all these different reasons that we presume that people could be making posts to social media. So given this, this taxonomy, we can have, well, the first thing we need to do is to collect the images and then actually have people provide the annotations for them. So we set up big studies on Mechanical Turk and presented people with anchor images that are shown to the left. And then they simply had to do a whole bunch of human computation exercises to click on images that they felt conveyed the same intent. Then we could do ablation or lesion studies that would allow us to disentangle the effects of content and intent in these images. So we could say, we could tackle for all these different subcategories within that hierarchy, that intentonomy. We could say, is intent just explicable in terms of content? Are there aspects of intent that are that transcend the pixel content and so forth? So we were able to characterize this across different categories. It's a very inhomogeneous space that we see across that spectrum. And furthermore, we brought in the domain of hashtags. So hashtags are something that could be highly relevant to almost like a sentence or caption description. They could be inside jokes, they could be inscrutable acronyms, but we also brought that into the picture so that we could get out some kind of mapping between images and a sub node within intentonomy, along with some kind of salience map that would explain why we got that result. Now, just a quick look at what Menglin is doing now. It's something we call VISE, which is visual engagement signals. This has to do with going beyond this kind of exactly what it says on the tin kind of captions that people often see in image captioning research. So if you're shown an image like this dog that has apparently torn apart a teddy bear, from a conventional computer vision machine learning perspective, you could imagine running an object classifier, which says dog, or a scene that could say indoor or living room. You could run it through a fine-grained classifier, which might tell you the breed of the dog, and you could run object detectors. So these are all very serious, anodyne, basic descriptions. They don't really capture the visual engagement. So together with Facebook, we collected a large data set of public posts. And this actually digs into the kind of visual engagement that we see in social media. For example, someone posting, does he know how cute he looks, or a sequence of emoji. So these are things that certainly have to do with the content in the image, but it's a bit more engaging at the human level. So this is another data set. This is work in progress. It's under review. But this is trying to get beyond that, again, beyond that content into something that's more about the emotions or the engagement that's desired on the part of the user. Now, moving on to Zikoun's project, another Cornell PhD student, what I just described, and I think a lot of work in terms of analyzing the flow of information online, is based on passive signals. We're provided with images or multimodal data, and we just want to make the best of it and classify it in some way, figure out why someone posted it. Is it an ill intent? Is it a positive intent? Well, Zikoun's work brings us over to the active illumination side, and it's oriented toward anti-tampering. So as everyone knows that's attending this workshop, deepfakes are becoming increasingly difficult to distinguish. Christian talked about that in the introduction. So there are going to be cases where passive means of detection are going to fail. So what we would like to do, preferably in a low-cost instantiation at some point, is to introduce active illumination into the scene that will produce a coded signal that to an observer that doesn't know that we're doing this, it would just look like a little bit of noise has been added to the signal. So we would increase the apparent variance of noise that's present in a recorded video clip, for example, of a talking head. So the idea would be that you have an LED based illuminator, or even just a pair of LCD displays, or just the left and right hand side of a display. And you're recording a talk, perhaps just like this, and you would run this sequence of active illumination to produce different coded signals, sort of drawing on theory of error correcting codes and so forth. So we have an illumination model. There's some basic stochastic signal processing. I'll skip over this. And the idea is you can take an original sequence, like the one shown at the top right, produce some manipulation, like by adding deep fake to the face, or producing a sign that has been inserted into the image. We introduced the coded illumination. In this case, it's just a single LED that's flashing present in the scene. So it's actively illuminating the scene. And then when we actually check for alignment with the code with operations that are little more than XOR calculations, you can see the evidence that something has been manipulated around the face region as well as where that fake sign has been inserted. If you move to something like multiple directions of illumination, like a monitor that's simply been split into two sides, and you produce the coded illumination from the left and the right-hand side, you can also get this added benefit of a kind of simple photometric or surface normal estimation. So you could do some kind of relighting. So instead of saying this is just an anti-tampering technique, you could potentially edit your video afterwards to get some basic relighting. And I'll skip over details here, but the point is that you're producing an active, you're actively introducing a coded signal, which allows you to do very simple cross-correlation type operations. So in terms of what Zecun is doing right now, which brings us to this broader theme of representation learning that can be used for things like fake detection or media that has been manipulated and recirculated with some kind of intent to deceive. So this new direction where Zecun is working and work in progress is trying to disentangle action and time. So the idea with this approach is that there are cases, for example, if someone is dribbling a basketball and shoots, there's a period in that clip at the top left where there's a repetitive action. So there's dribbling and then there's a dunk. And so the kind of thing that Zecun wants to do is identify those repetitive motions and distill them. And essentially, you can think of this from a perspective of intelligent fast forward or video summarization that preserves these kinds of essential repeated semantics. But the idea is also to be able to control it. So the idea, and at this point, we're just at the level of a simple repetitive motion example. The idea is you could take something like this top video where you have a set of metronomes that are moving independently at first. And then after a certain amount of time has passed, you can discover what the constituent repetitive motions are, identify them. And then what's happening on the bottom is that Zecun effectively has 5 independent knobs once those representations have been captured, and then he can move those metronomes independently. So at this stage, this is really just about focusing on a representation and what you can do with it. But the idea, more broadly speaking, is that when a piece of multimedia content has been shared on social media, as we know, it's subject to certain kinds of manipulation that could happen, such as slowing something down to make someone look impaired or to produce some kind of photorealistic content that doesn't reflect what really happened. So now, as I've mentioned, representation learning, I want to use that as an excuse to move in the direction of studying metric learning, because really at the root of a lot of these approaches is this process of finding rich representations, learning representations from data, and then using them to compute similarities. So that's for a long time, even before deep learning, that general flow has been a workhorse of all kinds of problems within large social media networks. For example, enforcing copyrights, or deduping and things like that. So Kevin Musgrave's project was essentially a deep dive into metric learning. And the spirit behind this, if I can take us back to ICCV 2015, what we wanted to do was look at how to fuse human and machine expertise. So we developed a technique called SNAC, stochastic neighbor and crowd kernel embeddings. And for those of you that are familiar with TSNE, Student T Distributed Stochastic Neighbor Embedding, there was a lesser known follow-up work by the same team called TSTE, which was Student T Distributed Stochastic Triplet Embedding. So there's TSNE and TSTE. So TSNE, which most people on this call have probably used multiple times, that's represented in the lower pathway here. So you have some kind of stimulus that comes in here, runs through a deep architecture, and you get something like a 1,000-dimensional vector. And then you run that through TSNE and you get some kind of embedding. TSTE, the one that makes use of triplets, is something that lends itself well to human expertise. So the idea with TSTE, and keep in mind, since it uses humans, you can't throw massive amounts of data at them, especially if you have qubit complexity. But the idea is to take a very small subset of the data, send it to human observers on Mechanical Turk, for example, and get that second component of a loss function, like TSNE plus lambda times TSD, to put that together to get a low dimensional concept embedding that has a lot of the legwork done by the conventional deep learning embedding extractor, but also is pulled on by the human observers who are specifying their notions of similarity. So this kind of thing, initially we used it for things like visual menu, if you wanted to capture the notion of foods that taste similar. We were able to capture that through triplet data. In the present context, we're interested in applying that to things like intent and multimedia, post similarity, and so forth. And toward that end, Kevin decided to just dive into this literature and just re-implement lots of methods and download code and just explore what was going on with deep metric learning. And so he started to dig into it, and it appeared that all of the results on deep metric learning benchmarks, they just kept getting better and better over the years, but he was pouring through the code and finding strange comments and little augmentations that were being applied at training time that were not mentioned in the papers, little inconsistencies in the resolutions that people were using. And so Kevin set up a very careful experimental process with train val test splits, developed a PyTorch library for metric learning. And the headline when this work was done was that while it appeared on the left that all of these deep metric learning approaches were getting better over the last decade plus, it turned out when you did these studies in a very controlled way that there actually wasn't that much progress relative to that original paper by Jan and Raya and Sumit. So this was quite a surprise, and he turned that report into an ECCD paper. So for those of you that saw this meme that got shared, this is just an example of baseline is all you need. Kevin's latest work is bringing that same formalism to unsupervised domain adaptation. I'm going to skip that in the interest of time since I'm running a little over. Returning to the idea of active approaches, in Jan's project, Jan Henrik's project, the way to think about this is in the context of a secondhand marketplace. So take, for example, Facebook Marketplace, and you have people who want to sell goods that might be fake. For example, a hardwood table or a leather handbag. And in this context, it's well known that on any secondhand marketplace, it's generally expected that the user would provide some kind of text description as well as photos. And generally people don't want only stock photos, they want real photos. And this is something where the goalposts are always moving because the technology, the commodity cameras and mobile devices people have are always changing. So our thinking here was, why not do something with at least rudimentary active illumination, so that when it comes to things like material that is described in a secondhand marketplace post, that we can do something a little more than just capture standard photos. So I'm not expecting that a typical user would do this today, but we're just describing in a WACV submission what we want to do, what we imagine could work in this kind of setting. So this is just a simple setup, capturing a homography, normalizing some views of hardwood, real hardwood and fake hardwood. This is just a glimpse at what some authentic hardwood looks like, imitations at the bottom. The rendered one in the middle is just a off-the-shelf CG model for rendered hardwood. And this taps into this idea of a single view BRDF. Generally, when people think about reflectance modeling, they imagine some kind of viewing hemisphere where you have to have all these different viewing directions with 2 degrees of freedom and all these different illumination directions with 2 more degrees of freedom. With the SVBRDF, we can use that when we have these planar surfaces, because that under the planarity assumption, you're actually getting a variety of surface normals and for a given illumination direction. So we can extract with this encoder-decoder mechanism from Deshantra, we can get out some kind of richer features where if the user is guided through this kind of wizard to capture these different reflectance and appearance features, then we can produce a new kind of classifier. We get out some deep features and use a simple support vector classifier, and we can actually do a much better job distinguishing these features. So obviously this isn't going to help if someone is uploading completely fake images that just come from another product. So one adversary at a time, we're just focusing on the case of raising the bar for what kind of images could be expected from online vendors in the future. There's a few other students' work I just wanted to flash on the screen since we don't have time to cover it, just along these lines of representation learning, since that representations are really fundamental to what we want to do in things like deep fake detection and generally analyzing the spread of information online. I wanted to take a minute just to plug our brilliant Cornell undergrads. So one interesting thing about this funding that Facebook provided to us was that there's a big chunk of it that Suriname set aside for undergrad research. So this started about 3 years ago. And so the Facebook AI provided a substantial amount of compute power, funding for students to do research, travel to conferences and so forth. And it was really blue sky research, but steered toward this problem of misinformation online. And I'm basically just shamelessly bragging that several of them have gotten into top tier PhD programs. They just graduated, and that's where they're headed now, to Stanford and MIT and so forth. So just the kinds of projects that they've worked on. Several people, I think, attending this workshop are familiar with how hyperbolic geometry has become more interesting in machine learning. When people are doing embeddings of trees or hierarchical data, conventional Cartesian embeddings are not that well suited. The way that trees spread out, sometimes exponentially, things get very crowded very quickly in Euclidean embeddings. So Riemannian manifolds and hyperbolic geometry in general is a more appropriate way to handle this, which means that you need new tools if you want to use this in a deep learning context to do differentiation. So at first, in the community, people were just approximating the necessary derivatives using pseudo means. But this group of undergrads said, why don't we do it the right way? And so they wrote a paper, which is essentially a mathematical study about differentiating through the Frechet mean, and actually got that into NeurIPS. And that turned out to be emblematic of the kind of work that these students continue to do. This neural ODE paper was a little bit more blue sky than the other ones, but some of the other student work involved other kinds of set representations, which is certainly useful in many contexts in social media, as well as things involving classic simple label propagation and putting it up against modern graph neural networks and showing that these old label propagation approaches might actually work better than we expect. So, and also a group of undergrads became interested in non-homophilous graphs, which is very useful in the context of social media, because most of us are on social media. we are not nodes in homophilous graphs. That would be a graph where everybody has the same preferences, likes the same Netflix shows, votes for the same political candidates. So doing large-scale learning on non-homophilous graphs is a foundationally underdeveloped area. And so another group of undergrads is tackling that in some ongoing work. So, and this is just a snapshot at what our undergrads produced with this support. So I would like to wrap up there. So we have a little bit of time for questions. Just wanted to thank all of our supporters at Facebook, and I just listed off the Cornell collaborators and the social media handles at the bottom in case anybody wants to follow up with more questions. And that's it. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much for your presentation, Serge. That was pretty inspiring, pretty interesting to see like the variety of topics that you are covering, all of them super relevant to this field of keeping not only like the media safe, but also like the social media and other interesting remarks here. I wanted to open the floor for anyone with any question. Have any question for Serge to start with?
Thanks for that, Serge. If I can ask a question, I think I must have missed something on the one slide that showed the performance of the detectors over time and how you did the correction, or can you just remind me what it was that you did there to make it look like it was flat as opposed to improving? Yeah.
So one of the typical benchmarks that's used in deep metric learning is Cub 200, for example, like a bird data set. Never mind what the labels of the birds are, it's just same different. Or the Stanford cars or something like that. So what this comes down to is just, you've got a whole bunch of same different data and you want to produce a metric that just returns on a held out set that two things are closer than two other things. That's what the metric comes in. Now, I mean, there's lots of ways to slice what that metric would be, but Kevin looked at all those different performance characterizations, came up with a consensus kind of performance characterization, and then said, okay, if in 2013, someone wrote a paper that says that they have advanced the state of the art on Cub 200 by such and such percentage, well, then that became a point in that plot on the left. And so what's shown on the right is when Kevin re-implemented everything with open source code so everybody can download it, it turned out that essentially the advantage disappeared and it was attributed to little dirty tricks. I don't mean bad dirty, the kind we all do, little dirty tricks in the code that were not mentioned in the paper.
Got it. Okay.
I'm not pointing fingers at anyone.
No. It's good. I just can't read the vertical axis. Is this maxing out at 80%? Is that what that number is?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay.
No, it's good. I just want, yeah, that was, okay. Thank you. That was helpful. Thank you.
Yeah.
Serge, thank you for your great presentation. I have just a curiosity, like, I mean, how did you find it difficult to understand the intent behind an action, what you presented at the beginning?
Yeah, we are at very early stages of this. Who can presume to know why someone posted something? I mean, and these examples come from Unsplash. Okay, so Unsplash is a stock photography agency. There's still a big gap between that and your friend from high school who posts something where if you really know that person, you truly understand why they posted it. So we know there's a big gap between this simple kind of study with generic MTurkers that are commenting on what they think the intent of something is and what's really going on at a micro level in social media. So really, we just want to start this conversation at a sort of generic level. And I don't mind if people tear it apart and explain how inadequate it is relative to actual sub-communities, but it's really just trying to start a conversation.
Oh, great. I mean, this is so important in forensics, and I just wanted to have your opinion on this. I mean, yeah. I think it's really great that you started to work on this.